Hello and welcome to the 10th episode of the Chicago Dialogues. This is a series of conversation that's been produced by the University of Chicago Center in Delhi in collaboration with Prohor.in in India. I am Dipesh Chakrabarty. I teach history at the University of Chicago, and I also currently serve as the faculty director of the university's center in Delhi. We've been very lucky to have Mr. Avik Chanda, who will be joining us and in this program. A writer, a poet, and a consultant for business, who's been the anchor and the curator of this series. And it is our great pleasure and honor to have as our guest today my colleague, Professor Raghuram Rajan, from our business school, the Booth School of Business. Professor Rajan, Raghu as I know him, is one of my most distinguished colleagues at the university. He is currently the Catherine Dusac Miller Distinguished Service Professor of Finance in the Booth School, but he was also the 23rd Governor of the Reserve Bank of India between 2013 and 2016. Before that, between 2003 and 2006, I'm sorry, the other number should have been 1,000 as well. He was the chief economist with the IMF. Raghu has been the winner of many awards, many prizes, much honor has come his way, all of which he deserved. And it is wonderful to have him on this program with us. So Raghu, we thought that, instead of asking you for the umpteenth time about your views of the Indian economy and its state, we will just talk more generally about India, various aspects of the country that we all are involved with emotionally, autobiographically, intellectually. So I thought I'd start off by asking a question about your experience, but starting from the premise that, all of us who grew up in India have worm's eye view of the country, right? We know our little part of India, we know the college we've been to, we know the university, but we really know into our neck of the woods. And you're one of the very few people who have the privilege of having both the worm's eye view of India growing up, but also the bird's eye view, both as the chief economist of the government of India and also as the Reserve Bank governor. And plus, getting to know other people who also operate with bird's eye view of the country, as they have to, and you occupy a top echelon, either in politics or in economy. So I was going to ask you maybe to tell us about how India seemed different when you had the worm's eye view of it, and when you began to have the bird's eye view of it, and if you can reconcile the two in your own life and experience.
Great. Well, first, thank you for inviting me here and giving me this opportunity to speak with you. Obviously, Dipesh, you are a very distinguished historian at the University of Chicago, and I've really enjoyed our conversations together. Look, first, I have to say that this is indeed a tragic time in India, given the pandemic and given the terrible sort of consequences, as well as the immense courage with which people are fighting it. Not just fighting for their relatives, which is a heartbreaking effort that many are engaged in, but also fighting for the broader public. The extent of voluntarism that you see right now, both in India and outside, the surge of effort in an attempt to deal with this plague is at some level both heartrending as well as heartwarming. So we must acknowledge this is probably India's greatest challenge since independence. I think when the pandemic first hit, the challenge was largely economic as a result of the lockdowns. Now the challenge is both economic, but even obviously personal, but also there will be a social element to this as we go forward. So I think we can talk about all that. But it certainly is important to acknowledge these are very difficult times in India, and our sympathies from outside. I was in India 2 weeks ago, again to deal with some family matters, but just seeing the extent to which this is affecting India is really mind-boggling in some sense. Um, that said, let's go to the question: the worm's eye view versus the view from a high table in Delhi or in Mumbai. And I think the question that any young person in India should have is, why aren't we, given the immense resources of our country, both natural as well as in terms of people, uh, at a different position in the global tables, if you will. Why don't we have more Nobel Prizes in literature? Why don't we have more sort of scientists making breakthroughs? Why aren't we a rich country? Right. I mean, that certainly was a question that I thought about a lot when I was young, because I had my father was a diplomat. I had been outside India for some time, and when I saw my friends in India, they just seemed no different from the young people I'd seen outside, and so it was strange to me why we weren't doing better as a country. I think when you go in to the establishment, you see the many sort of constraints on breaking free from the legacies of the past. Some of those constraints are, for good reason, because it prevents us from some of the worst aspects of life. But some of those constraints are mindless and have built up over time and actually prevent us from doing our best, from achieving our best. And often the task is to determine which is which are the constraints that are good and help us help protect our heritage, our sense of decency, our ability to move forward as a democratic country, and which are the ones that actually hold us back economically, that prevent ordinary man or woman from reaching their full potential. And the difficulty sometimes is, of course, that our history implies a range of vested interests have built around the constraints that hold other people back because they help some people. And that's really the challenge of institutional reform. Now, there are some constraints which are mindless, which nobody cares about, or they care about only after you've removed them because they see how they were, benefited from the rents thereof. Those are the easiest to tackle. The ones where there are vested interests that have built up are immensely difficult. And this is why a number of Indian reformers have focused on reform by stealth. Let's not tell them what we're doing, because if they wake up, they might actually oppose it really strongly. And I think that has its uses, but it has its limits also. And sometimes you have to reform not by stealth, but in full openness, because really what you need to do is have a dialogue with the parties that are going to be affected and say, look, this is standing in the long term. Uh, um, uh, you know, it's an impediment. We need to remove it for everybody's well-being, not just yours. And if there's one thing the pandemic suggests, it's we're all connected. We all sort of are hurt by the same sort of health system, by the same lack of access to proper medicine, to vaccines, etc. And no man is an island, no woman is an island, and therefore we need to address some of these problems collectively.
So, Raghu, it's very good that you began by reminding us of the tragic series of events that are unfolding in the country at the moment. And clearly some of the pandemic itself raises both of those questions, like what's happening at the grassroots, people's own behavior, people's lack of capacity sometimes to take responsibility for not wearing masks when they should have been wearing masks. But at the same time, it also creates those systemic questions like logistics. How many cylinders does the country need? Where do you produce them? How do you transport them? All those questions of queuing or operations. I mean, it produces both sides of the picture. And I was going to ask you, do you then, in the pandemic, when you look at the tragedy, does it confirm some of the things that you had observed before the pandemic about systemic constraints and let's say uh, historical accretions in people's behavior, everyday behavior? In other words, can one say that some of the characteristics of India that you would have observed otherwise, apart from the pandemic, are also at play in, let's say, the creation of the pandemic? One of the things I was thinking about as you were speaking about the distinction between reform by stealth and transparent reforms is this whole question of the lack of transparency about certain data in India, like how many people are actually getting infected, how many people, and part of it's sort of incapacity of the system. Like there's so many people, how many can you test? And part of it's maybe other reasons. But growing up in India, uh, you grew up with the feeling that this is a bureaucracy that doesn't quite believe in transparency, irrespective of who are the political masters at the top, right? I mean, it's a generally you feel it's a bureaucracy that's unresponsive to popular questions about transparency. And even the operation of the RTI Act in India has been quite amazing, because the statistics were, and this was kind of, I'm thinking, remembering figures that Arun Shourie was once giving for the first 10 years or so of the operation of the RTI Act, the number of RTI activists who had been killed is quite staggering. So I was going to say that, is there, in other words, as we think of India becoming a democracy, evolving as a democracy, do you think democracies need to be transparent about what's going on? Is transparency good for democracies as opposed to lack of it?
I think the answer is yes, of course. Transparency is important. Criticism is important. Free speech is important. Why? Okay, so and what may have created this sense that once you get into power, for 5 years you have unlimited sort of reign. I think Fareed Zakaria had a term for this, but basically the idea is it's all that matters in democracy is elections, and after that, you're free to run. That certainly is not the case, right? Elections are just the starting point, after which there has to be a constant monitoring, checks and balances on those in power to see that they're using the reins of office for good purpose. And that is where transparency really comes in. What are you doing? How have you done it? What is the success rate? What is the failure rate? And are you open to criticism? I think there is a fundamental sort of problem and in India, which is sort of a design problem we started with at the time of independence. Remember, at the time of independence, we had just undergone partition, which was again a very tragic situation. there was a lot of concern about the integrity of India, whether India would stay together as a country. We were obviously incorporating the princely states, which were, states that could have decided to declare independence on their own. Hyderabad was in close proximity to doing that. And so there was a focus on having a strong central government. We were seeing at the time of partition, even a central government was relatively weak in combating the forces unleashed, the hatred, the action and reaction that emerged as a result of partition, and therefore there was a sense that we needed a strong center. That there was a debate, as you know better than I do, between to some extent Nehru and Gandhi, but also Gandhi and Ambedkar, on the extent of centralization. Nehru was very much for a strong central government. Gandhi was about decentralization. India lives in its villages. We don't want to recreate the strong colonial government. You will be replacing a white babu with a brown babu. And that's not what we want. We want a change, a government that works for the people. Nehru was more for centralization, for the sense of the strong government, the integrity of India. And of course, because he was in charge, and to some extent he trusted himself to run the government and to create the institutions of government, he sort of believed that he was a Democrat, and therefore would put in place the necessary apparatus to make that work. Ambedkar, because he saw the village as a den of inequity, I think was the famous phrase he used, where old caste relationships would be forever embedded, while the modernizing city was a breath of fresh air where nobody inquired about your caste. And to that extent, centralization meant more power for the cities, and a sense in which a modern India would be different from the historical sort of inequities that had been imposed on the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. And so Ambedkar was also, and he was obviously a prime architect of the Constitution, was very much put his intellect in consonance with Nehru. And so what emerged was a much more centralized country. Of course, federal, because the states had powers, there were the different lists, etc., etc. But it was not a country where there was much local government. And that, I think, over time, made people less give them less of a sense that they had the ability to question government, to ask the district collector what he or she was doing and why they were doing it, questioned even the school teacher as to what they were teaching, because these were sarkari teachers paid by the state government, and they had absolutely no say on whether they would be paid or not, or whether they would be hired or not. And that lack of control over government, I think, has been problematic, because it now seems to be the case that we vote after government does whatever it does, and that's it. Obviously, over time, we have developed institutions like the press, etc., etc. But then it makes us very reliant on these institutions to function. If the press is co-opted by the government, then the extent of criticism of government actions is minimal. And of course, a government that gets no feedback in terms of criticism, that only gets applause from people close to it, and everybody else sort of either is silent or goes along. I think that then creates the possibility of going seriously off track. And unfortunately, that's happened to us, at least a couple of times in our history, where we have a government which doesn't hear the feedbacks because it has actively suppressed it, and therefore undertakes decisions which are, quixotic, to say the least.
So, Raghu, if I could come in here and soon bring Avik into the conversation, and following the track of this thinking, uh, I want to sort of bring to your attention some large scale changes that I see as having taken place in India. One is, of course, the growth of population. So, in my lifetime, Indian population has grown more than 4 times. The second phenomenon you notice is the expansion of the cities, the urban population, and the fact that it's a rapidly urbanizing country. And the third thing you notice, of course, is the phenomenon of the huge informal sector in which people are employed. And the fourth thing you notice is the rising cost of elections, right? And there's more money spent in elections than can be officially acknowledged. Right? So there's a question of a huge amount of money unaccounted for that is entering the political sphere. And one also notices that the central government has probably become even more powerful over the decades than it was when it started off for all kinds of reasons. Um, and the other thing that strikes me is, of course, that if you look at population distribution, the northern states, the peninsula is less populated than the northern states, which puts pressures on federalism. The other thing I want to mention was that on the one hand, you've had since the 70s the rise of low caste parties or Dalit parties, the Kanshi Ram and the Bahujan Samaj party, like the real kind of, it's a democratic aspect of that assertion in public life by these uh, formerly oppressed people or people who felt oppressed. On the other hand, India made a peculiar decision, understandable, that that it would not expand the parliament, the representative capacity of the parliament, in spite of the increase of population. Right? We put it off to, I forget when, 2030 or something, when they'll reconsider expanding the number of MPs. So we actually, for every MP, there's a larger constituency now to serve than there was before, and they're trying to compensate it by going through the panchayati, by devolving power through the panchayati system. So, do you think these macro developments, like large population, larger cities, larger informal sector, more money coming into politics, and do these things result in a certain kind of erosion of democracy? Do they create problems of management that then show up as problems of democracy as well?
See, all change creates pressure for adaptation, right? And if the country does not adapt, it creates tensions, frictions, conflict, etc., etc. And you've mentioned population growth, which absolutely has been a big factor. Relative population growth is, as you said, the north growing faster than the peninsular south, and the south growing richer than the north. These are a source of tension because clearly, going forward, there will be pressure for the south to fund the north. Because that's how finance commission grants, etc., work. Effectively, the taxation, the central taxation gets redistributed to some extent to places that are not doing as well. And of course, the South is going to ask, why? And then there is the growing sort of concern. I mean, I'm not 100% sure of the, but we froze the electoral representation based on a census. I'm trying to remember whether it was a 71 census or what it was. We froze it, but that is going to be unfrozen soon. And then the question is, will representation start moving politically to the areas that have grown in population? But as you know, wealth tends to limit population growth. So there are also the areas that tend to be poorer. and what does that do? So there are those tensions, but you haven't raised as much the tension which is sweeping the rest of the world and which is likely to sweep India also: technological change. That even as we need jobs outside agriculture, service jobs, as well as manufacturing jobs for our people, and those jobs pay significantly more than agricultural jobs. Even as we need those jobs, we are seeing immense pressure on the nature of those jobs. As you know, manufacturing jobs in the West have shrunk in number, being more automated, etc., etc. The difference in the number of jobs that the old car, the with a combustion engine, how many jobs are needed to produce that car versus how many jobs are needed to produce an electric vehicle. There's a significant difference, and that's even within manufacturing. Of course, manufactured goods are accounting for less and less. So there are immense differences that technology brings, and typically that puts an enormous pressure on people to get more education. And you can see the source of these tensions in India already, right? Many of the traditional land-owning communities, the Jats, for example, are finding that land no longer pays. So their social status is slipping. And as their social status is slipping, they are getting more agitated. The Patels also in Gujarat. What is there for us? Our old status is slipping, but we don't have easy access to government jobs. And we don't have as great an access to education. The pressure for jobs is immense, and we simply have failed over the last decade or more in creating the necessary jobs for the youth that are coming in. So our population dividend is at some risk of turning into a population curse. Unemployed youth on the streets, basically not knowing what to do. We need to turn this around quickly. And this is where economic growth sort of feeds into the need to keep social tensions and social conflicts limited.
Actually, Raghu, this would be a good place to bring Avik in, because he has some questions that come out of both these concerns and from what you've written on to address some of these questions. Avik.
Yeah. Thanks, Dipesh. I'm Dr. Rajan. A very warm welcome. Very good morning to you. I'll ask my first question. I'll situate that in the tone and in the context of the current COVID crisis that we started the program with. And I'd like us to look at it through the prism or in the context of the three pillars, right? The markets, the state, and the third pillar, the communities. Now, if you look at the first two, the markets have definitely taken a tumble, and the state, and I'm not making a political statement here at all levels, at a local level, at municipality level, at state levels, at province levels, district level, central level, have really been, grappling, really struggling to fight the ferocity of the contagion that we see. And maybe you've seen glimpses of it during your visit to India a couple of weeks back, but it is in this context, in this exigency, that we see the third pillar, the community, really coming forward and organizing testing camps, organizing vaccine camps, organizing oxygen cylinders, setting up databases and live sort of moving resources and helplines and emergency facilities, all of this, right? And in your book, the third pillar, there's this term that you've elaborated on. You've called it inclusive localism. I think what we see from the communities today is a shining example of that inclusive localism. So wanted you to comment on that. And also leading from that is a slightly longer term concern, is that once we get over this worst period, this darkest hour of the crisis, might be 6 months down the line, might be a year, there is a chance that the huge cohesiveness that we see in the communities today might again relapse and sort of brittle away and go back into their very insular pockets and become ineffective again. What can we do to make that third pillar as impactful and as cohesive as it is today on a sustained basis?
It's a great question, and my sense is that in the past there was a very real concern that the possibility of government was in fact crowding out the possibility of local action. I mean, I can remember going through villages when I was young, and seeing no sort of activity in the evening. The kids weren't playing; they weren't, and there were youth who would very well be happy to play volleyball. Why don't you play volleyball? Well, we need to build a court and get a net. Well, how much does net cost? Can't you put money together? Yes, but the 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 impulse to create local assets as a collective was in fact discouraged by the feeling that somehow the government can do it. There was, and of course, this varied from place to place. I'm just describing an anecdote. But my sense was that the ghost of the government crowded out a lot of activity. And this goes back to our earlier discussion. The government was too far away for you to bring it in and to ensure it did stuff, but not so far away that it couldn't come in at some point. And so, why do it yourself? Why build the local ditches, the canals, etc., when the government would do it at some point? I mean, you read the dear United States and how communities came together to build local resources. And you think about India in the past, when a lot of, I mean, you look at the irrigation facilities, for example, in Maharashtra, built over time using the lay of the land, very local in construction. And you ask, why can't we do that today? Why aren't we doing that? Why aren't we building using local effort? And somehow there seems to be an overhang. And I often thought it was the government that was the overhang, the possibility it could be done by somebody else for free, using public resources rather than we come together and do it. And that, I think, is the damaging effect of the centralization of power, the distancing of government from the people. And as you said, one of the effects of the pandemic is, one, we don't see government as present for a variety of reasons, which we don't need to go into, and we do see the need for action, collective action, and therefore people are banding together. Let me not take away from the fact that there have been some splendid situations where government has done what is needed. For example, in Maharashtra, the state government, or in Mumbai, has brought together sort of list of hospital beds, as I understand it, that are available at any point in time, and therefore you don't have to go hospital by hospital to check to see if there are any beds, as your father or mother is really is being dragged along in an auto rickshaw with if you're lucky, with an oxygen cylinder, trying to breathe to stay alive. I mean, at least that level of government sometime is working, but in some places, in many places, even that level of government is not there. So you are seeing some local initiatives pop up. Okay, where should you go? Can we arrange a bunch of cylinders for everybody? Sometimes some people are willing to use their contact lists to try and help others get in. Obviously, you need to be part of the network to start doing that. But I think there's a lot of voluntarism which is popping up. You asked the right question: does this stay or does it disappear? And obviously, it's the horror of such a pandemic which is creating some of this. But I do hope that as this passes, we recognize that there are situations where government breaks down, and there are situations where voluntarism, local action adds significantly to what a government can do. And can we sort of not lose this? Can we work on it? And I think post pandemic, if we don't ask serious questions of our society and where we are and what needs to change, I think it would be almost as tragic as the pandemic itself.
Indeed, indeed, Dr. Rajan. My next question is going to allude to something that you talked about earlier in the discussion. You talked about, the importance of the need of discussion, of debate, the right to dissent, right, and press, the freedom of the press, and also the co-opting of the press. I was rereading your book, I Do What I Do, and what I found interesting this time around is that you've published, let's say, a speech that you've delivered, let's say, at IIT Delhi, and then that is then followed by a little postscript. And there are many of these where this is the speech, this is what I wanted to talk about, this is what I meant, and this is how it was construed in certain sections of the media, right? And I found this to be very, well, partly amusing and partly not so amusing. I guess my point here is, when we're living in such a milieu where all of these sensibilities are touched to the quick very soon, very easily, and where there are clear chunks, not to make too fine a point on it, chunks or sections of people who suffer from a confirmation bias. I'm expecting to see something egregious, I'm expecting to see something controversial. So even if you say, hello, good evening, Avik, I'll say, why did he say good evening in that tone, right? So from that, I guess my twofold question is, how easy is it in today's sort of discourse, particularly in the public forum, how easy is it to be misunderstood? And the larger question from that is there then a real danger that when we have analysts, so we have experts, so we could have economists, we could also have epidemiologists, they are not going to come clean, they're not going to say something radical or which is going to prompt a lot of material changes, for fear of being taken to the cleaners, for fear of being trolled or threatened or worse?
I do think there is a real concern in the public dialogue in India that one is the lack of frank dialogue about the things that matter. Sometimes makes the press and the public look for anybody who speaks frankly, and then put all their vision, their ambitions onto that person, which then, as you said, sometimes every phrase they utter, every sentence they utter is interpreted for what larger sort of sense does this make. I mean, I never fully could figure out whether I was being seen as the token opposition by the press, and therefore everything I said, I never actually, I did not think it was my place to criticize the government for its actions as a member of the government. You don't sort of undermine your own institution. You can offer suggestions as to ways things could be interpreted, things could change, but you don't criticize the government. The famous IIT Delhi speech you're talking about was a plea for tolerance and respect for all, which my minister said was exactly what he was thinking. Whether that was interpreted by the public as what he was thinking is a different question. But it wasn't a criticism of the government. It was interpreted as a criticism of the government. And similarly, everything I said was when I said, remember, we were doing better than the rest of the world in terms of growth. And I said, we're doing better because the rest of the world is doing worse, not because we're doing really great. Something like we are the one-eyed man in the land of the blind. And of course, that got some pushback from the Blind Association. But more, it also, people said, how can you be sort of pessimistic about India's prospects? I was not being pessimistic. I was saying, let's not be complacent. And lo and behold, that quarter where I said that was the high point of our growth. We have come down ever since steadily. And so the point here is that things get overinterpreted sometimes because you're seen as the critic, and nobody wants to be in that position. So then the alternative is to just shut up, in which case you don't offer guidance when guidance is actually needed. And guidance often is needed because in that position that you may be the expert on certain issues, and it is important to offer broad guidance on those. So that's one. The more sinister view is that this was the vested interests, that they were creating a wedge by misinterpreting everything. And I think they succeeded in that because if you read the dialogue, even today, I was um, the guy who spoke out of turn, who made comments about things I had no business commenting on. I mean, read the speeches and ask if there was anything that was out of place, and that's part of what goes on. Now, I don't think the answer is to shrink back. I don't think the answer is to become a fellow traveler. Government needs to adjust, course correct, etc. It can be done in a polite way, it can be done in a respectful way, and it can course correct. But enough people within government and outside government have to speak up. Otherwise, we get a disaster.
I want to take you back to that famous speech at IIT Delhi, and to something which is not probably highlighted and ought to be. Because one of the things that you're talking about is the pressing need for the competition of ideas and the role that educational institutions across the country need to play in fostering, developing that culture of competition of ideas. And I want to tie this back to your earlier questions that you posed. Why isn't India producing more phenomenal research? Why isn't India producing more Nobel laureates, etc.? So in that sort of context, do you think education institutions today in India are doing enough to build that culture, that competition of ideas, and what can be done to improve it further?
I certainly think we are starting that process, and I think institutions like our venerable Indian Institute of Science, JNU, the IITs, St. Stephen's, Delhi University. I mean, they're all part of that process. I wouldn't say that that they're excellent academics in every part of India. But there are also new institutions which are challenging these old institutions. Ashoka, for example, but also an institution I'm associated with, Kriya, in the south. There are strong institutions that could emerge. But I think, again, what we need is free, open dialogue, free, open competition of ideas. We cannot possibly have a political dumbing down of the dialogue because it doesn't suit the powers that be. That is the way to sort of to essentially go into a hole, into a shell, never to emerge. When new ideas don't emerge. I mean, you might say, I want ideas only in technology. I want AI, I want this, that, but I don't want you to talk about liberalism, democracy, all those things don't particularly help. You cannot have one without the other. Many technological ideas challenge the establishment. If the establishment can shut down one set of ideas, it can shut down the other set of ideas. And the net effect is you don't get progress. So you have to, I mean, Amartya Sen wrote The Argumentative Indian. If that is our ethos, that is excellent. And that was part of the point of my IIT Delhi speech. That is really the basis for our movement into the 21st century. Any government, any party that wants to suppress that is killing our future, and therefore is anti-national at a very basic level. So I would say that we need freedom of speech, freedom to criticize. It is what will create that competition for ideas. it will prepare India for the 21st century far more than any reversion to our historic past and the glories thereof. Our glories are in the future, not in the past. Yes, there's lots to cherish in the past, but hopefully there'll be even more to cherish in the future if we play our cards right. The 21st century, we can play an enormous role there, but we need to acknowledge that there are aspects of India that we need to preserve for us to play that role.
Raghu, if I may quickly come in on the back of Avik's question then, but doesn't China prove the opposite? I mean, in the sense that you can have technological progress, you can have business booming, you can have development happening without discussions of liberalism, democracy, and human rights?
I would say that China before Xi Jinping was essentially moving in a more liberal direction. It started off with a stronger base than we have as far as education goes. And that's important to remember. The level of education attainment, the quality of that education was stronger, despite the movement backwards during the Cultural Revolution, etc. They were better, probably not in the highest education institutions. Our IITs were probably better, than any of their institutions at the start of their liberalization. But their average level of education was stronger. I think over time, as they developed, they also were liberalizing. The Communist Party was getting a little more open. They called, the Chinese way of democracy. I think where they turned was after Xi Jinping, when they have become more authoritarian. But they were already, quite successful by then. 30 or 40 years of post-liberalization growth, extraordinary growth. Now, I think the big question is, will they develop as effectively going forward? During this time, they've built strong educational institutions. Tsinghua University is fantastic. The quality of Chinese students coming out of China into US universities, tremendous. I see a large number of these people applying to our PhD programs across the board, whether STEM, economics, finance. I see far fewer Indians. And that suggests a difference which needs over time, given that our population is as big, to be remedied. We have to benefit from the educational institutions of the world in the same way that the Chinese have. But I would say that China was liberalizing. The big open question is, under an authoritarian regime, under a regime which is trying to contain the private sector much more than it used to, under a regime that is much more open to the state sector, whether they will progress as well. In my view, this coupled with Chinese population aging is going to be what stands in their way, not in the next 5 years, 10 years. They have the momentum of the past. But over the next 20, 30 years, they will have to revisit their system if they are to, be a contender going forward. I think this is a dialogue that's going on in China, but I think given their structure, it lends itself to the authoritarianism that we see now. India still has a chance to escape that and the competition for ideas that Avik talked about.
Dr. Rajan, we've got a number of questions that have queued up from the live audience, but before we go there, I wanted to touch upon another theme, if I may. You talked about AI and automation, technological disruption in the broader scheme of things. And we see that technological disruption only being accelerated, so labor-saving technologies only being accelerated in the wake or in the midst of the pandemic. And I guess my question therein is, what happens to job creation? What happens to job loss? Are they going to come back when the worst period of the crisis is over?
It's a great question. I mean, at a theoretical level, if machines can do the dirty jobs, that frees us to do the better jobs, right? The question that has been paramount is, are we prepared to do the better jobs? And what are the better jobs? And I think as we go forward, we'll figure that out. Now, it may be, and this may be what we're seeing, it may be is that some of the better jobs require government support. What do I mean by that? I mean, for example, in the West, a big crisis that is emerging is the crisis of loneliness. It has been exacerbated by the pandemic, but it is a huge issue that a lot of people are growing old alone. They got even if they got married at some point, they got divorced. Their kids have left and are not that attached, and they're living in cities which are anonymous with no contact with people. And so, if that is a crisis, how do we resolve that? Well, it may well be we need to try and enmesh them in social networks again. But some of those social networks may need to be created. Maybe you need happiness officers in each village or each locality, whose job is to check up on these elderly people and see that they're provided for. Maybe engage them in conversation. That's not something a robot can do. That's at least not yet. That is something that actually, even if it could do it, you would rather prefer a human being, because there's something different about a human being. And so there may be a whole lot of jobs which require empathy, which require attachment, which require everything that makes humans humans, including the fact that they may be unlikable or they may not like you. So you have to work to get them to like you, unlike a machine which is forced to like you. So there may be a lot of these jobs that emerge when we fully deal with the problem of production that we haven't dealt with yet. That said, I mean, there is a lot of scope for producing in a more effective way using the combination of man and machine, or woman and machine, rather than machine alone. And I think one of the things we'll figure out as we go forward is how to make that combination work. So take, for example, you might think that online courses will completely substitute for the teacher. Why do you need the teacher when you can get the best lecturers in the world to give those courses? But it turns out that the dropout rate from those massively online courses is huge. 5% of the students finish it. So what, didn't those fantastic lecturers help? No, they did, but it would have helped to have somebody asking you, have you done your homework today? Are you going to do it? Why haven't you done it? Why are you being lazy? Somebody is holding your hand and walking you through. That's what the teacher in our classroom does. So you may need a combination of the programs on the internet and the human teacher who sends you an email every few days asking you what your difficulties are, and sometimes sits down and explains how to navigate the whole process. And so, to my mind, I think it's too early to say there are no jobs. There are lots of jobs. We just need to create them and do them more effectively. And in the eventuality that we've taken care of all the basic production needs, well, we can find ways of keeping each other happy by creating new sets of jobs.
Dr. Rajan, I want to take you back to one of the main points, and I think that's the crux of the problem that's facing us. Are we equipped? Are we ready for the jobs of the future, right? And if we look at the latest World Economic Forum report around the future of work, the erstwhile, it was like a spindle-shaped thing, right? We had the specialists at the end and a kind of bloated, generalist. I can do a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and that is withering away. So on the one hand, we have the technology specialists, which I think we are quite equipped from a supply standpoint in India. Lots of courses and really good courses which are teaching people AI and automation and Python and so on and so forth, right? IoT. But the other end of the spectrum is where we have to have the behavioral competencies. So you're talking about empathy, you're talking about resilience. And the latest research in neuroscience, in cognitive psychology, proves that empathy can be taught, that resilience can be taught in the workplace. Unfortunately, neither the corporates, and this is my humble submission, neither the corporates nor the education institutes today are really equipped and really prepared to start teaching those to themselves first and then to the people who are working. So that creates a gap then.
Almost surely, a challenge in the next few years is going to be education. And it starts with the pandemic itself. So many poor kids have spent a year or more outside class, and they've fallen back 3 years, not 1 year, because they've forgotten what they knew. And now to get them back up to speed is going to be a huge challenge, because our systems have to be flexible. They have to bring the kid in. Remedial education has to be a huge part of what goes on to bring them back up to speed. And I really worry that we're not paying enough attention to this. This has to be, task one, because it could set us back many years if we don't do it right. So pay attention to education first, to get it back up to where it was pre-pandemic, which is a huge task in itself. And then think about new education. Certainly, there's a new education plan that the government has put forward, which has all the right sort of makes the right noises. The question is, how is it implemented, and how do we actually? Certainly, we have to look at the spectrum of jobs that are available. But also the spectrum of capabilities we need. It's not just jobs. We need functioning citizens, and that means people who are willing to dialogue, debate, and tolerate, others and different opinions. So we need to think about all this, and that requires constant reform of the system. For example, we have a system that tends to frown upon work with the hands. But many of the crying needs of India today that cannot be supplied by imports are working with the hands. A good plumber, a good electrician, a good painter, and it may be that for a number of people these will be the tasks which will create decent livelihoods outside of agriculture. How do we get them to move to that without training everybody up in a common and potentially not effective way for the jobs that are created? These are all the challenges that are in front of us. We've had some thinking on it, but we need to implement. And we need to implement very effectively, because we're starting way before the starting line now as a result of the pandemic.
Rajan, I know we've come almost to the end of the hour, but if you permit, we'll take up just 2 or 3 quick questions. So the first question is the one that was asked by Samira, and that's more to do with the MSMEs. Pretty much it's been a devastation, it's been ravaged right across the board as a result of the pandemic. But if you're looking at the MSME, they've been hit the hardest because they didn't have the working capital, they didn't have the funds, etc., which maybe hospitality or tourism might have had to an extent. So what could be done from a policy standpoint to get them up and running again?
Yeah, this is tough, right? As with there are lots of demands for funds at this point. We just talked about education. There's going to be health is going to need some funding, etc., etc. So the government has to allocate funds in a reasonable way. I think for the small and medium enterprises, clearly one of the issues for those that come out with debt is the debt too much, because they've taken on a whole load of debt. Equally important is, can they get credit to start up? Some of them had working capital. Now that's eroded or that's gone. As they begin again, will their working capital needs be met? So I think we need a quick bankruptcy process. Bankruptcy sounds an awful term, but it's really a process of restructuring your debt to make sure that you don't write it all off, but you write it to the level which is sustainable by the firm. So many medium enterprises, small enterprises typically don't get access to external debt, but medium enterprises that have taken on debt, we need a quick process by which they're almost a process of triage. We're going to, nope, you have no problem. You have too much debt. We're going to write it down with your creditors. You have no possibility of surviving because your business is gone. Close you down and release the resources because these entities sit on valuable factories, land, etc. That triage process, if done effectively, will bring the sector back to health. If not done, it means we have a lot of walking wounded in the sector who, there's that famous Ajit dialogue, liquid oxygen mein dal do, liquid isse jeene nahi dega, oxygen isse marne nahi dega. They'll be in that limbo. They can neither move forward nor close down. And that would be the tragedy because there would be an overhang over the system. So we need the process of forbearance cannot continue forever. It has to stop. We need to take a look at these enterprises, help the ones that can move forward with more credit, sometimes equity infusions, but close down the ones that can't move forward. That needs to be done. Unfortunately, it is a government task for the most part, government and the judiciary. And we should have prepared for that. If we haven't, we should do it now because the overhang of the small and medium sector can be tremendous. One of the problems in some of the dialogue that goes on is we see only the large firms. And large firms seem to be doing okay. International capital markets are open, etc. But large firms aren't where some of the employment is. And so we need to take care of the small and medium firms, and they don't get, they're not quoted on the stock market. They're not the stuff that people are excited about.
Absolutely. Just a quick aside to the viewers, thanks for all your questions. I've had more than a couple of dozen already on my plate. We're going to be able to take up just another 2 or 3. So the next one we'll take up is from Richie Pukan. And I'll just quickly read it out. So do you think that the targeting exchange rate stability would be a concern in the immediate future while also maintaining inflation targets?
I always said it's very hard for the central bank to target an exchange rate. What it can do is limit some of the volatility. But the best way to give people a sense of the stability of the exchange rate is to keep inflation low. It's when inflation goes through the roof that the exchange rate starts plummeting and becomes much more volatile. So that is why I often, emphasize the control of inflation, because that would be the best way to give people a sense of stability. I think the fact that we have an inflation targeting regime has helped convince international investors that India is a reasonable place to put their money, which is one reason why the RBI is sitting on a treasury chest of $600 billion plus. It's basically saying it has earned that trust with its targeting. Now, it has to deliver by keeping inflation within bounds, but that will be, I think, the best way to keep exchange rates reasonably stable.
Great. We'll take up another question, Oritro's question. So could you elaborate on how economic development or lack of it affects other social issues within the communities?
Well, that's a very tough question. It's a very big question. But I mean, the struggle for whatever resources there are almost surely becomes more tougher, stronger when growth is limited. When there's a lot of growth, well, I don't bother sort of taking the other guy's goods because there's plenty for me to get. I don't worry about the other guy having a job because there's a job waiting for me. And so, I don't try and use the political process or a riot to get at his property. When growth slows, there are a limited number of jobs. Now it's as if he has a job, he's holding my job, and so to get a job, I must get him out of the job. of
Become
he
a
has
zero sum.
property.
Become a zero
Yeah,
sum game.
it's a zero sum game, and positive sum games, as you very very aptly put it, uh, tend to be less conflictual than zero sum games.
We've gone well over time, so thank you very, very much, Dr. Rajan. It's been an absolutely engrossing conversation. Dipesh, that.
Yeah. No, Raghu, thanks again very, very much for joining us. This is something that uh, we've been doing from the center during the pandemic. I mean, this was one way to keep the center's presence alive and one way to introduce our faculty to people in India, the interested people. Avik and Pror have been terrific partners in this program. The Chicago, the center team have also helped to put these things together. So we have one more program to go. It's wonderful to have you on the program. Wonderful to listen to you as always. And thank you again on behalf of all of us. Yeah. And yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks for having me. And goodbye, everyone. And stay firm, stay courageous during the pandemic.
Thank you.
Thank
Stay
you.
well. Yeah. Bye bye. Bye.